And so good morning or good evening, depending on when you are listening to this. And may the Lord be with you and with your spirit. Today, this Sunday, has a number of options about which we could preach. And of course, when you give a preacher options, they hesitate and contemplate and imagine and just generally slow themselves down in terms of what do they want to do. Because when we have options and choices, it requires weighing and balancing the consequences and the directions. And so today we could think about Corpus Christi, which is celebrated in our Roman Friends calendar and in some of our very, very high church Anglicans, technically known as the solemnity of the body and blood of Christ. And I choose not to do that because that theme, I believe, runs through every liturgy that we have and every day of our life, and is less focused on the static presence of Christ in the physical signs of the sacrament, to me at least, than it is in the way those signs in that physical sacrament interact with our bodies and our lives. Now, this also is the week we celebrate the 116th anniversary of the founding of St. Albans, Chicago, a parish that has gone through ups, downs, ins, outs, and every possibility of how a parish life could be. And yet, through it all, has remained a place where there is a core of the committed community that makes up the church in a place, in a time, in a set of circumstances, in a set of challenges. Always fragile, and yet still surviving and still bringing the gospel, the message of the good news of the freedom of the children of God to whomever it touches in different ways every day, 116 years. And we can talk also about the lessons of the day, of which there are several different options, because now that we enter ordinary time, for those of you who are lectionary focused, now that we enter the summer period where we don't have the great feasts anymore, or the great seasons like Advent or Lent or Easter or Christmas, we have this counted time, these days that are numbered just like our own are numbered, I think, and in which we have some choices of what we read. And one of the choices we have that begins today really is from the book of Samuel. Now, Samuel is of great interest to some of us for a lot of different reasons, one of which is if you were ever a Hebrew student, you would have probably at some point, especially years ago, you would have encountered a book by Samuel Driver called Notes on the Hebrew Text of the Books of Samuel. And it would have been a tome, and all it had was really grammatical references from what they knew at the time about Hebrew. This thrilled seminary students. Yes, it was the days before the internet and video games and everything else. But yeah, it was exciting. And it paralleled the efforts to also begin to learn that the language itself and the text itself, the grammar itself, was not the inspired part. It was the interaction of the text. The writers, the inspirer, and the hearers. And eventually those of us, I think, who learned that grew to think differently. And so today, and over the next few weeks, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the book of Samuel. Now, today we start remembering that the book of Samuel starts in this revolutionary sort of way, this turning upside down way, because Hannah, who in some ways has a speech that prefigures Mary's in Luke, Hannah goes to the temple, a barren woman, mad about her husband, preferring, she thinks, his second wife, who is not barren, and begs God to give her a son, and if he does, she will give him to God forever. And while she's praying, she is accused by the priest, Eli, of being drunk. And she says, "Oh no, I'm not drunk. I am desperately crying out." In any event, she bears Samuel. Samuel is ultimately dedicated to the Lord. He serves in the temple. He brings Eli the message that Eli's family, his sons, are screw-ups. They will not be the inheritors of the judgeship or the priesthood. And things begin to progress. Israel is encountered by the Philistines. Israel loses the ark. Israel loses so much. And in that, Eli dies. Samuel takes over. Samuel's sons are nothing to think about either. Now, in the midst of the chaos and the weakness and the eventual recovery of the ark, but in the midst of this chaos, this indecisive, difficult time, Israel comes to Samuel and says the following: "All the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like the other nations.' But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to govern us.' Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, 'Listen to the voice of the people in all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice only. You shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of a king who shall reign over them.' So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, 'These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, to be his horsemen, to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, no, we are determined to have a king over us so that we may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. The word of the Lord. And so it was, and so it is, when we demand leaders to replace the Lord and to take over the responsibility that we had or have for our futures and our lives. Now, everything Samuel said became true. As we know, the kings of Israel that you can probably name might include Saul, who ended up in disgrace, David, known for his greatness and yet his great failings, Solomon, the same thing, and after Solomon, who of you can really name or imagine or remember many of the kings of Israel? Because the kingdom did end up deteriorating, and even in the great kings, everything Samuel said was true. And we know it was true, not only from the Bible, but because we know in our own experience. What is demanded when we accede to, demand, and support a great government, a great leader, somebody who will lead us and take the responsibility that we can depend on and see and touch. Now, in the case of Israel, what was being replaced was the real serious idea that God himself was the monarch and had these enormous responsibilities for the people. Not only to provide for them in terms of a place and a land, succession of their tribes, their sons and daughters, their seasons, their times, their presence with God, their ability to withstand threats from those who were pagans. They replaced this direct relationship with God to the relationship of an earthly king. And we know what earthly kings are like. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and no matter what your intentions are, those who become kings or great leaders, presidents or mayors, unless there are things to contain them, which there rarely are, ultimately begin to believe in their own power, and in doing so, diminish the collective, the whole, the community, the individuals within them. When I was a young college student, one of my professors, Mary Ellen Muckenhern, known to some as Sister Charles Borromeo, who had been the chair of the theology department at St. Mary's Notre Dame for years before she left that community, was famous for some of her sayings that we wrote down because they were all very revolutionary, and I remember one of the things I wrote down was her saying, people who want great leaders are sick. They don't want to accept the responsibility of their own actions, lives, potential, and possibilities. That I think is true of us in the church, it's true of us in the community, it's true of us in our families, it's true of us in our nation. We, all of us, I think, just like Israel, perhaps not as theologically inspired, but somehow need to return to the notion that we cannot devolve responsibility for the future or even the present. That we cannot devolve the responsibility for ensuring the liberty of God's children to leaders who, whatever their political affiliation or stripe or notions are. We can't devolve that responsibility to them, because in order to be who they are, they need to believe in a righteousness, an ability, and a privilege that they have that is not shared by the rest of us, and that is not derived from subservience to God, even though they might claim God as the seat of their power, or their faith in God as the rationale for what they do. We, as communities, as church, as members of the commonweal, need to remember that it is a juvenile notion that we be like others. Because all of us may remember when we were young and our mother said, you can't do this, or you must be that, or you can't be like that, and you said, but everyone else does it. Everyone else can have it. Why can't we be that way? I remember saying, why do we have to be inside for pasta dinner every single Sunday at 2 o'clock that starts at 11 o'clock with sitting down and getting ready and so on and so forth? And then follows the rest of the day, and we can't go out like the rest of the kids. And the answer was, well, you're not like the rest of the kids. And that's it. Those who have religious responsibilities. I live in a family, an area of Orthodox Jews. I'm sure there at some point at which kids say, why can't I be like the other kids on Friday night? Because you're not like it. We are not like it. None of us are like it, because we are chosen, all of us, wherever it is we are, if we admit to and submit to our vocation as change makers, as children who are liberated, as people of hope, of people in love. We are not like the nations. And when we ask to be like the nations, what we are doing is the same as the Israelites, which is saying, in this period, which is saying, make us like the people who are less. And God is honest and says, I will give you what you want, but here are the consequences. In this time we live in of so many transitions, of so many questions, of so many ways in which our communications are no longer trustworthy, in which our identities are being shaped differently because we haven't been together, we need to say to ourselves, we do not want to be like others. We want to be who we are, who you are, who I am, as a community, as a governance, as a church, as a family. And to accept the consequences of that decision, which are not necessarily easy, but which also might be amazing. We'll continue the journey with Samuel. We'll continue the journey with each other. And I pray and ask you to pray for me that we have the strength to say, no, Lord, not like the nations, like ourselves, the ones you have created us to be, and continue to love, and even when we can't see it, to form, to care for, and to save. Let it be so.